Hey everyone, What If Fan here, bringing you another exciting part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World. You can find the fanfic title and the original author's name on my Patreon page. Make sure to check it out and show them some love. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. Alright, let's jump into it. Chapter 261. At this moment, deep within the frigid confines of the Ice Palace, Uehara Shiroa lounged comfortably alongside Shihoin Yoruchi and Nell. The unusual trio, two powerful adults and one seemingly innocent child, were all fixated on a crystalline ice screen, watching the live broadcast of the Karakura Town defense war with varying degrees of interest. Nell, her large childlike eyes gleaming with fascination, bounced excitedly on her cushion. "This is so cool. Look at them all fighting," she exclaimed, clearly entertained by the spectacle. Born and raised in the harsh wastelands of Hueco Mundo, such elaborate battle tactics and strategic warfare were entirely foreign to her. Uehara Shiroa cast a sideways glance at the former Espada, a hint of amusement playing across his features. He felt that her reaction betrayed a certain ignorance, but he couldn't really blame her. "Of course you'd find this fascinating," he mused. "But this is understandable," he added with a casual wave of his hand. After all, in terms of surveillance and intelligence gathering, Hueco Mundo really can't compare with Soul Society. Indeed, Soul Society possessed what one might call a rich history of being monitored, a fact that Shiroa found endlessly amusing. For centuries upon centuries, every significant event had been observed, recorded, and analyzed by various factions. There was the automatic text records of the Great Spirit Book Corridor maintained by the Tsuneyashiro family, a treasure trove of historical data that few were privileged enough to access. Then came the all-round monitoring capabilities of the Image Hall, a technological marvel that could capture events across different realms. The Technology Development Bureau had their own sophisticated Keto and technology-based surveillance systems that extended their reach far beyond the borders of Suriidii. Not to be outdone, Soya Azushiro had implemented specialized Bankai monitoring, while the shadowy Invisible Empire operated their own covert surveillance network that few knew existed. From the lofty heights of the Soul King Palace, the Zero Squad utilized their clairvoyant monitoring to keep tabs on potential threats to the realm. And of course, the triumvirate of Aizen and his conspirators had their own methods, as did the ever-resourceful Urahara Kisuke with his unique blend of Keto and technological innovations. And naturally, Shiroa thought with pride, "There's also my own perfect-level observation hockey." His abilities far exceeded those of the other surveillance systems, allowing him to perceive reality with a clarity that others could only dream of. In the not-too-distant future, Aizen would establish his own spiritual monitoring network that would permeate all three realms: Soul Society, the human world, and Hueco Mundo, extending his influence to unprecedented levels. These old foxes all shared a morbid desire for intelligence, constantly gathering information and establishing networks of surveillance. They reminded Shiroa of the Nick Fury archetype from the Marvel Universe. The paranoid mastermind who builds safe houses all over the world, preparing for every contingency, trusting no one completely. That was precisely why Uehara Shiroa had prepared his countermeasures from the very beginning. He had meticulously isolated himself from all forms of surveillance, creating a perfect bubble of privacy where none could observe his actions or divine his intentions. In the end, he still had the last laugh. While others scrambled and fought, he could watch these people battle to the death in perfect comfort, untouchable in his sanctuary of ice. For him, this war was both entertainment and opportunity, a season of harvest where he could reap the benefits of others' struggles without putting himself at risk. This was, without a doubt, a victory for the sunny and cheerful big boy that he presented himself to be, an image that concealed the calculating intellect beneath. Is Aizen really that strong? Yoruchi's voice carried a note of genuine fear as she watched the chaos unfold on the screen. Her golden eyes were wide with disbelief at the devastation a single Shinigami could cause. Fortunately for her, she had not acted on impulse when first learning of Aizen's betrayal. If she had chosen to rush headlong into battle against him, as her pride might have demanded, she would certainly have found herself in grave trouble. Even with her considerable abilities, even if she had brought all her family's artifacts and unleashed her power at full capacity, she would have been easily defeated by a monster of Aizen's caliber. Initially, when Uehara Shiroa had warned her of Aizen's terrifying strength, she had been somewhat dismissive in her heart. She thought that perhaps he was exaggerating the threat Aizen posed, unable to believe that any Shinigami could be so formidable. Now, watching the reality of Aizen's power displayed so dramatically before her eyes, she realized just how ignorant she had been. Thankfully, due to Shiroa's timely warning, she had immediately abandoned any notions of seeking revenge against Aizen. As this realization settled in her mind, Yoruichi's gaze shifted to Uehara Shiroa, her eyes growing increasingly fiery with admiration. With his strategic mind, it's impossible for him not to have seen the threat Aizen poses from the beginning, she thought, studying the relaxed figure beside her. In other words, Uehara Shiroa must have absolute confidence in his ability to defeat Aizen if necessary. As expected, only monsters can defeat monsters. Although she couldn't fathom the depths of his power, or understand what trump cards he held that allowed him to so casually ignore the threat of Aizen and remain so relaxed, she chose to believe in him without reservation. After all, Uehara Shiroa had repeatedly proven himself to be a person capable of creating miracles, a genius among geniuses, a true prodigy whose existence defied conventional understanding. His strength was so immense that it transcended the imagination of fake geniuses like herself and the other captains. However, as her attention returned to the battle on the screen and she saw Kurosaki Ichigo's hesitation in the face of Aizen's manipulations, Yoruichi's expression softened with sympathy. "We really owe this guy a huge debt," she said with genuine regret in her voice. "He really didn't have to risk his life fighting because of our mistakes. The battle between Shinigami should never have involved mortals like him and his friends. This is our failure." "Hey, it has nothing to do with me," Uehara Shiroa responded coolly, clearly disagreeing with Yoruichi's perspective. He crossed his arms and continued with calm indifference. "You are not comparing yourself with me correctly. First of all, this is your mistake, yours and the other Shinigamis. I didn't make any errors, nor was I deceived by Aizen for even a moment." He paused, gesturing dismissively toward the screen. "Secondly, Aizen's words are designed only to deceive children. Anyone who believes his rhetoric is a fool, plain and simple." He shook his head, a touch of disdain coloring his tone. "You really haven't suffered enough if you're still willing to listen to that guy's endless chatter. In this regard, you should really take a page from Kurosaki Ichigo's book, Just Refuse to Listen." "I don't want to hear it, I won't hear it." "And then chop him down directly. No conversation needed." Shiroa's philosophy was clear: when facing manipulative intellectuals like Aizen, there was no point in engaging with their rhetoric. It was like traveling to the world of Jingguan or Pailai and encountering wise men like Xiao Rulai or Wenhuang. You must never waste time talking philosophy with them. The only effective approach is to physically seal their lips before they can speak. In his view, the best way to deal with the so-called wise men was to defeat them directly through superior force. Just as when confronting a dragon king about to unleash a devastating attack, the wisest course is to tear away his ability to speak before he can even begin. This was why the philosophers of ancient Rome were renowned for their physical prowess as well as their intellect, because sometimes, physical persuasion was also necessary. Facts had proven time and again that a wise man incapable of fighting was not truly a complete wise man. In Uehara Shiroa's eyes, Aizen was entirely analogous to a CPU manipulating Kurosaki Ichigo's actions like a video game character. His rhetoric wasn't merely a diversion of conflict, it was an outright lie, a transparent attempt to fool those gullible enough to listen. The most frustrating part was that Ichigo Kurosaki was genuinely shaken by these manipulations. On this point, Uehara Shiroa had little to say. Regardless of how much nonsense Aizen spouted, the fact remained that he intended to sacrifice Karakura Town and slaughter Ichigo's family and friends. Even if Ichigo didn't particularly care for his father, he couldn't simply stand by and watch as his two innocent sisters were reduced to ashes. It could only be said that Ichigo Kurosaki's reasoning abilities were somewhat lacking. His brain was experiencing what Shiroa mentally termed pig brain overloaded syndrome. Of course, this was partly because Ichigo was still caught in a state of hesitation and fear. The image of Aizen as a great devil was even more profound, more visceral, and more terrifying than it had been in the original timeline that Shiroha recalled. The pressure of facing such an opponent was enough to make anyone falter. Chapter 262. In addition to Aizen's manipulations, Ichigo Kurosaki still harbored lingering fears about the power of the hollows that dwelled within him. This internal conflict made him vulnerable to Aizen's psychological control, clouding his judgment at the most critical moment. In truth, Uehara Shiroha reflected, it wasn't entirely Ichigo Kurosaki's fault. The blame lay squarely with Aizen for being so unfathomably insidious. If even a group of thousand-year-old demons couldn't overcome this four-eyed mastermind, what chance did Ichigo Kurosaki, a mere lamb in comparison, truly have? In Aizen's presence, all of Ichigo's thoughts and secrets were exposed like an open book. The Shinigami captain could read him with terrifying ease, anticipating his every move and counter. What made it even more troubling was that Aizen seemed to care about Ichigo Kurosaki's growth and development more than his biological father, Isshin Shiba, ever had. He had studied the boy's potential with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Observing this dynamic, Shihu and Yoruichi sighed helplessly. "You're right," she admitted, acknowledging the depth of Aizen's manipulation. "Aizen's eloquence is just like his Kyokusuajetsu, both disgusting and incredibly powerful." However, she added, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully as she watched Ichigo on the screen, Ichigo seems to have become stronger yet again. Perhaps he really does possess the potential to defeat Aizen. She paused, then qualified her statement, of course, that's assuming Aizen hasn't completed his hollowization process. Something inconsistent had been nagging at Yoruichi's mind. Kurosaki Ichigo's potential was blindingly obvious to anyone with eyes to see. With Aizen's notoriously cautious character, it seemed strange that he would willingly ignore such a clear threat to his plans. After all, this was a boy unaffected by Kyokusuajetsu's perfect hypnosis, a rare vulnerability in Aizen's otherwise flawless defense. And yet, strangely enough, Aizen had never attempted to use Kyokusuajetsu to control Kurosaki Ichigo directly. This anomaly didn't fit with everything she knew about Aizen's methodology. Recalling some of Uehara Shiroha's peculiar comments about Ichigo, Yoruichi felt her perspective expanding. Perhaps there were possibilities here that she hadn't yet considered, angles to this complex game that remained hidden from review. So the pattern needs to be opened up, Uehara Shiroha remarked, sensing her thoughts. He shook his head, disagreeing with her assessment. What you perceive isn't necessarily the truth. For example, what you interpret as a world-destroying disaster is, from my perspective, merely an elaborate performance, a show choreographed for specific eyes. He leaned back, his posture relaxed despite the gravity of his words. The existence that you revere as a god might be nothing more than a vague illusion, as ephemeral as a mirage in the desert. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on the orange-haired boy displayed on the ice screen. However, I won't deny that Kurosaki Ichigo does possess something special. It's unfortunate that he's too young and inexperienced right now to exert his true strength. His power remains largely untapped. The current version of Kurosaki Ichigo held little interest for Uehara Shiroha. But the potential of what he might become, that was worth watching. The boy was, after all, the little spirit king in waiting. Ichigo's bloodline was arguably more complex than the Spirit King's in certain respects, granting him even greater potential. Critically, he possessed the power of hollows, something the Spirit King had never incorporated into his being. This gave Ichigo unique advantages and possibilities that could potentially surpass the ancient ruler. However, Ichigo's flaws were equally evident. Even now, he had neither fully mastered his own power nor developed his true strength. He was like an uncut diamond, valuable, but requiring significant refinement before his true brilliance could shine. That said, Uehara Shiroha had noticed that Ichigo's Ryatsu had undergone some kind of transformation. This subtle change indicated that he had further liberated some of his latent potential. This development was closely tied to his hollowization process and the emergence of what some called Juto Ichigo. For Ichigo Kurosaki, donning a mask to temporarily become a wizard was merely the initial awakening, a first tentative step toward applying the power of hollows. The true manifestation, Juto Ichigo, was comparable to the legendary returned blade, representing the full awakening of his hollow powers. After experiencing the death-like rampage against Ulquiorra, a significant part of Ichigo's dormant power had finally been fully awakened. And behind this apparent coincidence stood none other than Aizen, the puppet master pulling the strings from the shadows. Both Ulquiorra and Grimjo had been specifically chosen as prearranged opponents. The true significance of these Espada's existence wasn't as mere antagonists but as catalysts designed to force Ichigo to fight monsters and level up, fully unleashing his hollow powers through necessity and desperation. This was merely one facet of a larger design. The awakening and evolution of Ichigo's Shinigami powers had been carefully orchestrated by Kasuke Urahara, while Yhwach would eventually play a similar role in fully awakening his Quincy heritage. 3 godfathers, 3 distinct powers, all converging in one vessel. The combination of these 3 forces would eventually create the real, complete Ichigo Kurosaki, a being of unprecedented potential. The full awakening of Ichigo's powers was, in fact, part of an even grander scheme. A plan conceived by the Soul King himself alongside the enigmatic monk, Hyasube Ichibai. Under the subtle manipulation of these adoptive father's entities who had shown more interest in his development than his biological father ever had, Ichigo was being guided step by step toward awakening all his powers and evolving into his strongest possible state. And when all was said and done, it would be the Soul King and the monk who would have the last laugh. Uehara Shiroa suspected that even before Ichigo Kurosaki was born, the Soul King and the monk had already designated him as their unwitting agent, a thug who would eventually eliminate Yhwach when the time came. The Soul King simply wanted a vacation from his eternal duties, while Hyasube Ichibai was content to remain the county magistrate's wife, caring little about who ultimately ascended to become the next Soul King. As long as his own position of power remained secure, the identity of the figurehead was irrelevant. This made Yhwach, with his worldly wisdom and ambition, the perfect candidate to become the next Soul King, a replacement ruler who would bear the burdens of office while others maintained their grip on true power. Of course, if Yhwach should somehow fail in his destined role, then Ichigo Kurosaki would become the backup candidate for the new Soul King. The boy's mixed heritage made him uniquely suited for the position, perhaps even more so than Yhwach. In reality, there was no fundamental contradiction between Yhwach's goals and those of the monk in Squad Zero. Yhwach didn't oppose the concept of the Soul King, he opposed the artificial separation of the 3 realms of life and death. When the world eventually returned to its original state of neither life nor death, it would still require a wedge, a stabilizing force called the Soul King, to maintain cosmic equilibrium. Therefore, the identity of who became the Soul King was ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was that there must always be a Lich King to maintain the balance. In this elaborate scheme, Ichigo Kurosaki was simply a chess piece that could be sacrificed if necessary. In fact, everyone involved was just a piece on this cosmic chessboard. Ichigo had been thoroughly used from the beginning, the quintessential chosen one who paradoxically had no real power of choice. His fate had been arranged with meticulous precision long before he drew his first breath. But none of this truly concerned Uehara Shiroha. Although he could see through the entire plan with perfect clarity and possessed the ability to change it if he wished, he had no desire to intervene. Since everyone else seemed intent on using Ichigo Kurosaki for their own ends, Shiroha saw no reason why he shouldn't do the same. After all, what was one more puppeteer pulling at the boy's strings? He had done his part by warning Ichigo in advance about the nature of the game being played. If the boy chose not to heed those warnings, the consequences were his own to bear. From this point forward, Uehara Shiroha would simply wait for the distribution of treasures and focus on completing his own special tasks. Let the others fight their life and death battles, he had more important matters to attend to. Chapter 263. Meanwhile, in Karakura town, Aizen continued his one-man war against a formidable assembly of captain-level Shinigami. The battle had reached its crescendo, with devastating attacks being exchanged on both sides. Back in the Ice Palace, Uehara Shiroha was thoroughly enjoying himself. While receiving an expert massage from his 2 companions, one adult and one child, he watched this real-life drama of Bleach unfold with undisguised entertainment. The subsequent plot developments followed remarkably closely to what he had foreseen. On the crystalline screen, head captain Yamamoto Genryosei Shigakuni found himself sealed with his own Zanpakuto through Aizen's machinations. not one to be defeated so easily, the ancient warrior employed the advanced Hakuta technique, double bone, using his bare hands to brutally hammer Wonderweiss after the Arrancar had sealed away his blade. The sight of the shirtless, muscular old man standing amidst roaring flames was truly impressive, a bold warrior of incomparable might. In Uehara Shirowa's irreverent opinion, Yamamoto looked like a more powerful, battle-hardened version of Master Roshi from Dragon Ball. However, even the head captain's formidable strength wasn't enough to overcome Aizen's sinister planning. The mastermind had deliberately designed Wonderweiss to self-destruct upon defeat, using the Arrancar as a living bomb to catch the old man off guard. In the end, Yamamoto was forced to sacrifice an arm in desperation, containing the massive explosion with his own body to protect the real Karakura town. Despite this valiant effort, he had only managed to injure Aizen, not defeat him. As the strongest Shinigami in Soul Society, Yamamoto Genryusai Shigakuni's power was beyond question. The old man was essentially a numerical monster wielding what amounted to a nuclear bomb. His advantages were obvious to all, but so too were his limitations. Ryujin Jaka, with its attack power rating of 927, was overwhelming in its destructive capacity, literally overflowing with heat that could reduce anything to ash. Yet for all its might, it was not invulnerable to countermeasures. This was why, when facing Yamamoto Genryusai Shigakuni, intelligent opponents would invariably seek ways to neutralize or seal Ryujin Jaka. A frontal assault against such power would be suicidal, so the logical approach was to avoid direct confrontation entirely. Nuclear bombs are indeed devastatingly powerful, but their effectiveness is negated if they cannot detonate or if their target is elsewhere when they do. This simple principle underpinned most strategies against the head captain. It wasn't that Yamamoto was truly invincible or guaranteed victory in head-to-head combat. Rather, from a tactical perspective, avoiding his strengths and exploiting his weaknesses was simply the most reasonable and optimal solution. Uehara Shirowa mused that the world of Bleach differed significantly from One Piece in this regard. Here, there weren't so many glorified head-on confrontations or dramatic power-ups mid-battle. The focus instead was on tactics and intelligence, finding ways to circumvent an enemy's strength rather than overpowering it directly. In battle, there was no need to test oneself against the enemy's strongest point. Such an approach was fundamentally inefficient and tactically unsound. Even Yawatch, with all his overwhelming power, would eventually develop specific countermeasures against Yamamoto's Bankai rather than trying to overpower it directly. Breaking an opponent's weakness was, in truth, the kingly path to victory. Therefore, as formidable as Ryujin Jaka and Yamamoto Genryusai Shigakuni were, they too had their flaws and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Similarly, even Aizen's seemingly perfect Kyoka Suigetsu had its methods of circumvention. Only someone like Uehara Shirowa, who possessed infinite trump cards and absolute strength across multiple dimensions of power, could be considered truly invincible, and only because his abilities could not be effectively targeted or countered. As the battle continued to rage, Aizen was gradually approaching his limits. Even with all his planning and power, he was beginning to feel the insufficiency of his current form. The limitations of being a Shinigami were becoming apparent to him, driving his desperate desire for transcendence. In the Ice Palace, after listening to Uehara Shirowa's analysis, Shihoin Yaruchi nodded in agreement and leaned comfortably against him, her body relaxed despite the chaos they were witnessing. She had been thoroughly convinced by his reasoning. Thanks to Uehara Shirowa's timely advice, she had abandoned her initial impulse for revenge against Aizen. She recognized now that such a confrontation would have been disastrous. Yaruchi wasn't performing poorly in her assessment of the situation. Rather, she had simply come to understand a fundamental truth: if the Zero Squad and Uehara Shirowa weren't rushing to intervene, why should she? The fact that these immensely powerful individuals remained calm suggested that everything was proceeding according to some greater design. The situation, despite appearances, was not spiraling out of control. No matter how powerful Aizen might become through his transformations, he couldn't escape the invisible web of control that Uehara Shirowa had woven around him. The mastermind had become just another piece on Shirowa's cosmic chessboard. Yaruchi understood that there must be compelling reasons why Uehara Shirowa had chosen not to take direct action yet. Similarly, the continued non-intervention of the Soul King Palace was telling. As the former head of the Shihuan family, one of the four great noble houses, Yoruichi was privy to certain truths about the Soul King and the fundamental nature of their world, secrets that most Shinigami would never learn. Throughout history, the Soul King had been revered as the supreme existence, his position unassailable and absolute. This wasn't merely a matter of tradition or respect, it was necessity. The world literally needed the Soul King to maintain its structure and balance. As heirs of the great noble families, they were sworn to prevent the Soul King from falling from the sky, a metaphorical description for any threat to his position or existence. They had no choice in this matter. The preservation of the Soul King was equivalent to the preservation of reality itself. For millennia, no one had possessed the ability or capacity to replace the Soul King even if they had wanted to. His role was unique and irreplaceable, or so they had believed. Until recently, with the sudden emergence of figures like Aizen and Uehara Shiroha. For the first time in history, the Soul King's position as a god had become potentially unstable. Both Aizen and Uehara Shiroha had demonstrated capabilities that suggested they might possess the power to replace the Soul King should they choose to do so. Yoruichi naturally opposed Aizen's ambitions to usurp this cosmic position. His methods were twisted, and his goals seemed more focused on personal power than maintaining the balance of worlds. Uehara Shiroha, however, was different. If he were to ascend to such a position, Yoruichi saw no fundamental problem with it. After all, despite his mysterious origins, he had proven himself to be one of their own, someone who understood the delicate balance of the realms and didn't seek to destroy it out of mere ambition. Nevertheless, caution was ingrained in her nature after centuries of service as the head of the Onmitsukido. She turned to Shiroha, her golden eyes searching his face for reassurance. "Are we really going to do nothing?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of lingering concern. "Just watch as Aizen completes his plan? Be careful with your cat." The last part was a playful warning, a reminder that even a domesticated cat could turn dangerous if pushed too far. It was her way of suggesting that Aizen might yet surprise them if left unchecked. "Even if the cat turns into a tiger, it's still fine," Uehara Shiroha replied with absolute confidence, his tone revealing not the slightest doubt. As he spoke, he casually slapped away Nell's small hand as she attempted to secretly pilfer some snacks from their shared platter. The childlike Arrancar's eyes immediately welled up with tears, her expression suggesting she wanted to cry but didn't quite dare to in Shiroha's presence. Noticing that Yoruichi still seemed somewhat confused by his relaxed attitude toward what should be a crisis of cosmic proportions, Shiroha nevertheless chose not to elaborate further. Some knowledge was better left unshared, even with allies. To the average Shinigami, the Soul King Palace, Squad Zero, and the Soul King himself represented supreme beings beyond question or challenge. Even the four noble families, with all their accumulated power and privilege, couldn't openly oppose the decisions of Squad Zero. Even Aizen, for all his revolutionary rhetoric and ambition, harbored special feelings toward the Soul King, a complex mixture of envy, respect, and resentment that colored his every action. But to Uehara Shiroha, the Soul King was nothing more than an elaborate decoration, a figurehead whose symbolic importance far exceeded his actual relevance. The ancient being held no special meaning to him beyond being another piece in the cosmic game he was playing. Creating the three realms and maintaining their separation was certainly an impressive feat, but it wasn't the Soul King's exclusive patent or unique ability. What the Soul King could accomplish, Uehara Shiroha was confident he could replicate in the future and likely improve upon in the process. More importantly, what the Soul King couldn't do, the limitations that had defined his existence for millennia, Uehara believed he could transcend. When one reached the point where they could look down upon gods from above, those same gods became indistinguishable from mortals in their insignificance. The most revered statues were reduced to ordinary sculptures, their supposed divinity revealed as mere fantasy. This was the reality as Uehara Shiroha perceived it, a perspective that few in any realm could comprehend, much less share. He settled back comfortably, a small smile playing across his lips as he watched the battle continue to unfold on the ice screen. Let them fight their desperate battles and struggle against fate. He would wait patiently for his moment, secure in the knowledge that the true game had barely begun. Chapter 264. At this moment, a certain artifact concealed within Shihuan Yoruichi's attire produced a strange fluctuation, a subtle pulse of energy that manifested and disappeared almost instantly. Her golden eyes narrowed, and her expression darkened with suspicion. "Someone was watching us just now," she stated firmly, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. It was an extremely sophisticated surveillance method, so advanced that even my family's artifact couldn't fully detect its source or nature. Her brows furrowed in concentration. Could it be a backup plan left by Aizen? The possibility seemed logical. Hueco Mundo was Aizen's territory, after all, and Uehara Shiroa represented the single greatest threat to the traitor's ambitions. It would be entirely reasonable for Aizen to have implemented contingency measures here. Hidden surveillance systems designed to monitor his most dangerous potential adversaries. What troubled Yoruchi most, however, was the sheer sophistication of the surveillance technique. The detection capabilities of the Shihuan family artifacts were legendary, developed and refined over thousands of years. For something to evade them so completely spoke to a level of power that exceeded even Aizen's known capabilities. "It's just some noise, nothing to worry about," Uehara Shiroha replied with casual dismissal. As he spoke, he subtly increased the strength of his observation haki, extending its reach and potency to suppress the sight of a certain peeping Tom who had dared intrude upon his privacy. "Hayasube Ichibai, are you peeping at me?" Shiroha thought to himself, his mental tone laced with irritation. "This monk is really a piece of shit." His internal monologue continued with increasing contempt. "He neglects his actual duties but is brimming with malicious intentions. The man is ungrateful, a pure white-eyed wolf. He doesn't care about anything that doesn't directly involve the Soul King, and he wouldn't hesitate to throw even innocent bystanders under the bus if it served his precious master." Shiroha's disdain for the monk was palpable even in his private thoughts. What can he really do besides aspiring to be the Soul King's wife? That's all he's ever wanted. To remain in that privileged position beside the throne, wielding power without responsibility. A grim smile crossed Shiroha's face as he contemplated his next move. "Soon, I'll launch an assault on the Soul King's palace and give that collection of self-important Zero Division captains a proper shock. It's time they learned that their vaunted position doesn't make them untouchable." Miles away, in the Zero Division Hall under the jurisdiction of Ichibai Hayasube within the Soul King Palace, all the captains of the Zero Division had gathered once more. Their attention was fixed on an array of sophisticated surveillance equipment arrayed before them. Several translucent screens floated in the air, each displaying different angles of the ongoing battle between Aizen and the Gotei 13. Some of these surveillance feeds were the product of advanced Kido techniques, while others were directly connected to the unique abilities of Hayasube Ichibai, the Eye Monk. As his title suggested, Ichibai's clairvoyance abilities were extraordinary, capable of seeing through the barriers between the three realms and even penetrating into the spiritual world of individual beings. Such comprehensive surveillance methods were terrifying in their scope and precision, second only to the all-knowing and all-powerful eyes of Yawatch himself. As Ichibai Hayasube activated the full extent of his abilities, one of the screens shifted to display a majestic, breathtakingly magnificent crystal structure and ice palace of incomparable beauty and complexity. Within its frozen hall stood a gorgeous throne crafted entirely of ice, the craftsmanship so exquisite that it seemed to have been shaped by divine hands rather than mortal ones. Upon this majestic throne sat a tall, straight-backed, and remarkably handsome young man. As if sensing their observation, he suddenly looked up, looking directly at them across the impossible distance, his gaze somehow penetrating the one-way nature of Ichibai's surveillance. The young man's demeanor remained perfectly calm and composed, but his eyes flashed like lightning, containing a hidden divine light that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. The next second, his mouth curled upward in a knowing smirk, and the screen monitoring him instantly exploded into countless fragments of spiritual energy, the connection severed completely. Witnessing this unprecedented occurrence, Wang Yu and the other members of the Zero Division visibly tensed, their expressions shifting from shock to solemnity as they processed the implications of what they had just witnessed. "Oh my, we were discovered." The leader of the Zero Squad, Hayasube Ichibai, stroked his black beard thoughtfully as he exclaimed with a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. "This young man is becoming more and more terrifying by the day. He can not only detect but completely neutralize my abilities. Fortunately," he added with calculated optimism, "he is on our side of the Shinigami. The current Hyasub Ichibai had conveniently forgotten his previous assessment of Uehara Shiroha. When they had first encountered the young Shinigami, Ichibai had noted with alarm that Shiroha demonstrated no respect for the five noble families, the Soul King Palace, the Zero Squad, or even the Soul King himself. At that time, Ichibai had bluntly stated that this kid is not the same kind of person as us, but since his existence did not seem to immediately threaten the established order, they had reluctantly decided to tolerate his presence. Now, however, Hyasub Ichibai appeared to have completely forgotten those words of caution, choosing instead to claim Uehara Shiroha as one of their own, a convenient fiction that allowed him to avoid confronting the potential threat the young man represented. Otsunomiya, however, was not so easily convinced by Ichibai's sudden change of heart. The Zanpakuto creator raised an eyebrow and responded in his characteristically exaggerated tone, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What? You said you were merely discovered," he questioned incredulously. "Let's be honest, you were completely suppressed. Is this real? Did this actually happen? Is it the power of some unknown Zanpakuto?" The flamboyant man clutched his chest dramatically. "As the sword god himself, even I don't understand it. What a humiliating failure." His expression shifted suddenly to one of genuine admiration. "I must say, I really want to compose a song to praise this remarkable youngster for achieving what no one else has managed to do." As an ancient monster who had lived for untold tens of thousands of years, and as the second in command of the Zero Division, Otsunomiya understood better than most just how abnormal and formidable Hyasub Ichibai's abilities truly were. It was no exaggeration to say that the monk's thousand-mile sky-seeing eyes possessed the ability to penetrate the very fabric of heaven and earth, observing all things across vast distances with perfect clarity. Legend held that this extraordinary power had been personally bestowed by the Soul King himself. Combined with the amplifying effects of the Okan, the King's Key that granted the Zero Division their enhanced abilities, even the other captains of the Zero Division could not hope to resist or suppress such surveillance techniques. And yet, a Shinigami who had existed for less than 2 centuries had effortlessly neutralized their leader's signature ability. A feat that should have been utterly impossible. It was akin to a minnow defeating a leviathan, neither reasonable nor comprehensible within their understanding of spiritual power. Wanyua racked his brain trying to determine how Uehara Shiroha had accomplished such a feat. This mystery paralleled his ongoing confusion regarding how the young man's Zanpakuto had somehow managed to escape their influence and control. Even Yawatch, the son of the Soul King himself, had ultimately been dealt with by the Zero Division's combined might. How then could a mere Shinigami prove so inexplicably resilient to their power? King of the Valley Kiryu Hikifune, her brow furrowed in concentration, voiced the confusion that gripped them all. "It's genuinely perplexing," she exclaimed, her scientific curiosity piqued. "But we've confirmed it through multiple examinations. This young man's flesh and blood are fundamentally different from our own, yet he doesn't possess any identifiable special powers that would explain his abilities. By all measurable standards, he possesses the ordinary body of a Shinigami." She shook her head, growing increasingly frustrated by the contradiction. "There is no trace of any external entity or influence within his physical form. So where exactly does his extraordinary ability originate? What kind of existence could possibly provide such tremendous power? And why," she added with growing unease, "do we know absolutely nothing about the nature of his abilities despite our collective millennia of experience?" Chapter 265. Kiryu Hikifune's confusion was particularly noteworthy given her extensive scientific background. As the former captain of the 12th Division before Urahara Kisuke, she possessed not only a powerful intellect but also the rigorous scientific mindset that had defined her leadership. Even now, centuries after leaving that position to join the Zero Division, she maintained the same insatiable curiosity and analytical approach that had made her such a formidable researcher. She was an absolute expert in life sciences and the study of alien souls. Disciplines that should have equipped her to understand any spiritual anomaly, no matter how unusual. What made Uehara Shiroha so perplexing was that, despite her expertise, Hikifune could detect nothing out of the ordinary about his soul's fundamental composition. His soul was remarkably pure, without any of the telltale signs of hybridization or contamination that would suggest external influence. There was no evidence of a god's hexagram, the distinctive spiritual pattern that marked those touched directly by the Soul King's power. Instead, the young man's soul radiated with a brilliance that was both pure and powerful. Its light was so intense that even Hikifune, accustomed to examining the most exceptional souls in existence, found herself turning away, simultaneously shocked and envious of its perfect clarity. The irony wasn't lost on her. Years ago, she had invented the revolutionary technology of fusing alien souls, the Jikin or artificial soul technology. Precisely because she had recognized the inherent limitations of her own soul's power. That technology had eventually evolved into the Yaowen method that had allowed her to modify her own soul and ascend to the Zero Division. And yet here stood Uehara Shiroa, possessing a soul of such natural purity and power that it made her hard-won enhancements seem primitive by comparison. It was difficult for her to comprehend how a supposedly ordinary Shinigami, a mere 007 spirit born in the Rukongai, could naturally develop such an extraordinary soul. Uehara Shiroa is unquestionably not an ordinary person, she concluded silently. Perhaps there is some terrifying existence lurking behind him, some entity or force that we cannot detect even with our combined powers. Meanwhile, the beautiful and intimidating Shut-Era Senjimaru, the Great Weave Guard, examined the broken surveillance screen with clinical precision. Her multiple mechanical arms extended and retracted as she analyzed the fragmented spiritual particles, her expression one of scientific intrigue rather than concern. "How fascinating," she remarked, her icy voice betraying a hint of genuine interest. "It appears to be some kind of mental ability acting directly upon our surveillance technology across vast distances." Her mechanical fingers delicately sorted through the disintegrating spiritual particles. "The destructive potential is remarkable. What makes the power so devastatingly effective? Is it due to some unique property of his Ryatsu? Or perhaps, she hypothesized, his soul has undergone some form of mutation that our instruments cannot identify?" In Shitara's analytical mind, it was simply inconceivable that a pure Shinigami without some infusion of the Soul King's power could ever possess abilities of this magnitude. Logic dictated that there must be some other entity or secret behind Uehara Shiroa's extraordinary capabilities. Yet despite her best efforts, she could identify no plausible explanation. More troublingly, it seemed that even Hayasu Bichibai, with his millennia of experience, and the Soul King himself, with his near-omniscient perception, had failed to uncover Shiroa's secret. The implications made her mechanical arms twitch with excitement. A power that potentially surpasses even the Soul King, she mused to herself. Is such a thing even possible within the framework of our reality? Her lips curved into a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Uehara Shiroa is the very definition of mystery. I would dearly love to dissect him, study him thoroughly, and perhaps convert him into one of my mechanical constructs. Such potential should not be wasted on mere existence. Our own people? The seemingly rough and uncouth hot spring demon Kirinji Tenjiro interjected with a bark of laughter. Unlike his refined colleagues, Tenjiro preferred direct speech to diplomatic niceties. Hey, are you all kidding yourselves? Have you forgotten what we're dealing with here? He gestured aggressively toward the screens showing Aizen's battle. Look at what Aizen has done and what he intends to do next. He seeks to create new life forms that mimic our power, to blaspheme against the established order, and ultimately to overthrow the Soul King himself. His voice dropped to a growl as he continued, and what does Uehara Shiroa do during this crisis? Despite clearly possessing the ability to stop Aizen in his tracks, he chooses inaction. He doesn't fight alongside the Gotei 13, doesn't defend Soul Society, doesn't lift a finger to prevent catastrophe. Tanjiro slammed his fist against the wall, his expression thunderous. And you have the audacity to claim this guy is one of ours? If you want my honest assessment, those who suggest he might be working with Aizen have a more credible argument. Based on Uehara Shiroa's pattern of behavior, I believe he represents an even greater threat than Aizen himself. The hot-tempered captain's concerns weren't without merit. While Aizen's ambitions were clear and potentially manageable, Uehara Shiroa remained an enigma, his powers seemingly limitless, his true intentions obscured behind layers of mystery. I can understand why our focus remains on Aizen for now, Tanjiro continued, his voice growing more measured. As long as we defend the Soul King Palace, our primary objective is secure. Aizen's potential, while significant, is at least visible and understood. His power will never exceed our collective ability to contain it. His expression darkened further. But this Uehara Shiroa, he represents a different category of problem entirely. His abilities appear endless, his strength unfathomable. Such an opponent would be extraordinarily difficult to neutralize if he ever turned against us. Everything is in the Soul King's plan. Hayasu Ichibai interjected hastily, his tone carrying a hint of desperation beneath its forced confidence. In situations like these, when faced with anomalies that defied explanation, he could only attribute the circumstances to the Soul King's inscrutable wisdom. It was a convenient approach to uncertainty, much like how in other realms, all blame for a village's misfortunes might be attributed to a shadowy figure like Konohagakure Danzo. By Ichibai's reasoning, all developments in the world of Bleach, no matter how inexplicable, were ultimately part of the Soul King's grand design. Ichibai held fast to this belief, not necessarily because he had evidence for it, but because the alternative, that events were occurring outside of the Soul King's awareness or control, was too terrifying to contemplate. After lying dormant in the Soul King Palace for tens of thousands of years, he had long since abandoned his youthful ambitions in favor of simple self-preservation. His primary goal now was merely to maintain the status quo and ensure his own continued existence. Given the imminent threat posed by Aizen's rebellion, the assembled captains of the Zero Division reluctantly decided to postpone any further discussion regarding Uehara Shiroa until after the current crisis had been resolved. This pragmatic approach allowed them to focus on the immediate danger while giving them time to gather more information about the mysterious Shinigami who had so effortlessly thwarted their surveillance. Meanwhile, in the replica of Karakura town where the battle raged, Kurosaki Ichigo stood frozen in shock, his mouth hanging open in disbelief as he surveyed the fallen captains of the Gotei 13 scattered across the battlefield. His eyes were wide with horror, his mind struggling to process the devastating display of power he had just witnessed. The words of warning Uehara Shiroa had once offered him echoed in his mind, suddenly carrying new weight in light of Aizen's seemingly limitless strength. Ichigo himself had just been taught a harsh lesson by Ikemaru Jin. The silver-haired captain had engaged him briefly, but it had become quickly apparent that Jin wasn't truly interested in defeating him. After a short exchange of blows, Jin had simply disengaged and retreated to a distant vantage point, apparently content to observe the unfolding spectacle rather than participate directly. There had been something distinctly unsettling about their encounter. Ichigo had noticed that Jin's Ryatsu possessed an unusual quality: it conveyed no emotions whatsoever. This was profoundly abnormal. Typically, when Zanpakuto crossed and spiritual pressures intermingled, Ichigo could sense his opponent's thoughts and feelings through their Ryatsu. It was like a spiritual language that spoke volumes beyond mere words. But Ikemaru Jin was different. The fox-faced captain's heart seemed empty, a void where emotions should have been. It was as though Ichigo had crossed blades with a perfectly crafted puppet rather than a living being. Despite this peculiarity, Jin's combat abilities had been undeniable. Without relying on hollow powers or any special enhancements, using only the pure strength of a Shinigami, Ikemaru Jin had effortlessly suppressed Ichigo's attacks. Even with his hollow mask activated and his Bankai released, Ichigo had found himself completely outmatched. The experience had given him a new appreciation for the terrifying combat potential of captain-level Shinigami who had honed their abilities over centuries. And yet, despite this sobering realization, what he now witnessed was even more incomprehensible. Aizen, standing alone against a coordinated assault by multiple captains and vizards, had emerged not only victorious but virtually unscathed. The pinnacle of Soul Society's military might, including the legendary Yamamoto Genryusai himself, had been reduced to broken figures on the ground, their sacrifice yielding nothing more than the loss of the head captain's arm. After defeating Yamamoto, Aizen surveyed the fallen Shinigami with an expression of profound disappointment. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a weariness that bordered on disgust. "Each one is so pitifully ugly in defeat," he remarked coldly. "You are all so weak, so ignorant, so terribly vulnerable. I should never have harbored such inappropriate expectations for such fundamentally flawed beings." He shook his head, as if admonishing himself for a miscalculation. I freely admit that this was my error. I grossly overestimated your collective strength, just as I overestimated the capabilities of my espada. Neither group proved worthy of the faith I placed in them. Chapter 266. Aizen's words carried more than mere disappointment with the individual captains of the Gotei 13, they reflected his fundamental disillusionment with the very concept of Shinigami power. He had reached what he perceived as the ceiling, the absolute limit of what a Shinigami could achieve. In his mind, captain-level Shinigami represented the pinnacle of their species' potential, and that potential had proven woefully inadequate to his ambitions. He could neither accept nor reconcile himself to such limitations. His desire, his obsession, was to transcend the very nature of Shinigami existence and ascend to stand in the heavens themselves, looking down upon all creation from heights no Shinigami had ever reached. From his comfortable vantage point in the Ice Palace, Uehara Shiroa assessed the Gotei 13's performance in this war with clinical detachment. In his estimation, their showing had been mediocre at best, characterized by tactical errors and missed opportunities. A prime example was Yukite Jushiro, the supposedly seasoned captain of the 13th Division, who had been dispatched almost instantly by Wonder Weiss. The white-haired captain's performance, in Shiroa's judgment, was comparable to that of an undercover agent betraying his own side, spectacularly ineffective and counterproductive. The man never truly entered a wartime mindset from the beginning, Shiroa mused critically. In warfare, showing mercy to one's enemy is not only taboo but fundamentally irresponsible to one's comrades. Yukite's hesitation and innate gentleness had nearly resulted in Kayaraka Shuinsue's death, a needless risk to a valuable ally. Shiroa found this particularly galling since, in his view, a comrade's life held equal value to any other. Sacrificing allies through indecision was inexcusable. The head captain, Yamamoto Genryose Shigakuni, had been similarly disappointing, though for different reasons. The ancient warrior had grown overly reliant on Ryujin Jaka's overwhelming firepower, developing a form of path dependency that made him tactically predictable. He had become too accustomed to regarding his Zanpakuto as the ultimate solution to any conflict, neglecting to adapt his strategies to specific opponents. Despite clearly fighting against Hollows and Arrancar, Yamamoto had somehow forgotten the cautionary tale of Shiba Kaien's death, a stark reminder that conventional approaches could fail catastrophically against enemies with unusual abilities. Such forgetfulness was inexcusable in a commander of his experience. The pattern of poor decision-making had been evident from the start. When the conflict began, Yamamoto had confidently declared he could eliminate Aizen with just a few strikes of his blade, only to discover that his opponent was far more resourceful than anticipated. In response, the strongest Shinigami had carefully prepared an all-or-nothing technique, intending to sacrifice himself along with multiple captains just to ensure Aizen's destruction. This murderous resolve echoed his approach from 1,000 years ago during the Quincy conflict, but it lacked the decisiveness that had characterized his younger self. In that critical moment of hesitation, he had been sealed by Wonder Weiss. And after finally unleashing his most devastating attack, he had been forced to absorb the backlash himself, neutralizing his own greatest weapon. What frustrated Uehara Shiroa most was that none of the Shinigami had bothered to question why Aizen would willingly confront Ryujin Jaka head-on. Instead, they had placed all their hopes on the head captain's legendary Zanpakuto, making failure inevitable once it was neutralized. In short, across multiple critical decision points, the Gotei 13 had consistently chosen the worst possible options. The only reason they hadn't been completely annihilated was that Aizen apparently had other plans for them. Had he genuinely wanted to destroy the Gotei 13, they would have suffered far worse than mere defeat, they would have been systematically exterminated. Uehara Shiroa concluded that Soul Society was fundamentally flawed, both in terms of battlefield awareness and organizational structure. Their rigid hierarchical system hampered adaptability and independent thinking, leaving them vulnerable to opponents who could think beyond conventional tactics. Of course, the Espada weren't much better in his estimation. Beyond their fearlessness in the face of death, a quality more related to their hollow nature than actual courage, the Arrancar army possessed few redeeming qualities. They projected an illusion of unity but functioned as scattered, independent fighters with little coordination or strategic cohesion. On one point, however, Uehara Shiroa found himself in surprising agreement with Aizen. In the world of Shinigami, collective action and group tactics ultimately counted for little. True power, the kind that could reshape worlds, came from individual strength pushed to its absolute limits. Conquering all obstacles through overwhelming personal power was indeed the true kingly way. For Shiroa, organizations like the Gotei 13 represented mere entertainment value rather than serious military considerations. His true trump cards lay not in alliances or armies but in his own carefully cultivated abilities. Back on the battlefield, just as Aizen successfully evaded Yamamoto Genryusei Shigekuni's final desperate attack, Kurosaki Ichigo seized what he perceived as a brief opening. Donning his double-patterned fox mask once more, he channeled his spiritual energy into Tensa Zangetsu and launched himself toward Aizen with explosive speed. Whether due to his unprecedented velocity or because Ikemaro Jin, absorbed in observing the spectacle, had positioned himself too far away to intervene, Ichigo's sudden assault proceeded without interruption. For once, the silver-haired captain failed to react in time, allowing Ichigo to close in on Aizen unchallenged. Getsuga Tensho. Ichigo's black-clad figure became a blur of motion, crossing the distance to Aizen in an instant. The concentrated black ryatsu surrounding Tensa Zangetsu crackled like dark lightning, splitting the sky and shattering the very rocks beneath their feet with its pressure alone. This time, without the protection of his million ryatsu shield, Aizen appeared momentarily vulnerable. Though he attempted to evade at the last second, his reaction came fractionally too late. The edge of Ichigo's attack connected, and the black ryatsu surged forward hungrily, the razor-sharp blade cutting through all spiritual defenses. Aizen's left shoulder erupted in a spray of blood as the spiritual pressure tore through flesh and bone alike. It's not over yet. Emboldened by drawing first blood, Kurosaki Ichigo immediately followed through with another devastating slash, releasing a crescent-shaped wave of concentrated black spiritual energy. A surge of hope filled his chest. Finally, this guy is injured and bleeding, he thought, adrenaline coursing through his veins. That means he must be reaching his limit. If I keep pressing the attack like this, victory might actually be possible. But this time, Aizen was prepared. With preternatural grace, he pivoted to face the oncoming attack, simultaneously raising Kyoka Suigetsu to intercept while shifting his position with a flash of Shuunpa. A thunderous explosion echoed across the battlefield as the two spiritual attacks collided head-on. Ichigo's black ryatsu, for all its intensity, scattered against the perfect edge of Aizen's counterstrike. In the same moment, Kyoka Suigetsu blocked Tensa Zangetsu's follow-up slash, the two blades meeting with a shower of spiritual sparks. Locked in this momentary stalemate, the two combatants found themselves face to face, their blades crossed, spiritual pressures intermingling in violent counterpoint. At this crucial juncture, words were unnecessary, silence is better than words. Their opposing ideologies, disparate personalities, and conflicting ambitions collided in that singular moment, communicating more through spiritual pressure than language ever could. But then something unexpected happened. Several blue spiritual veins began spreading from Aizen's chest, extending outward until they reached his injured left shoulder. Before Ichigo's disbelieving eyes, the wound began healing at an extraordinary rate, flesh knitting together, bone reforming, blood flow ceasing as if time itself were being reversed. Super speed regeneration! Ichigo exclaimed, his golden pupils contracting beneath his double-striped fox mask. A wave of dread washed over him as he processed the implications. Has Aizen completed his hollowization already? This is catastrophic. How can anyone defeat an enemy with both Aizen's intelligence and a hollow's regenerative abilities? Hearing Ichigo's startled exclamation, Aizen's expression remained impassive, though a hint of amusement glinted in his eyes. Super speed regeneration, he echoed calmly. Do you believe I have become a hollow? Unfortunately for your theory, that's not the case. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips. This is merely the Hogyoku protecting its master, a demonstration of our symbiotic relationship. For Aizen, this moment represented the culmination of decades of careful planning. After orchestrating countless events from the shadows, manipulating hundreds of lives like pieces on a chessboard, it was finally time to reap the rewards of his patience and vision.
The Hogyoku embedded within his chest and the extraordinary young man standing before him represented his two most successful research outcomes, living proof that his scientific brilliance had not been wasted.
One would grant him the power to transcend the limitations of Shinigami existence, while the other had unwittingly served as the perfect test subject to validate his theories on spiritual evolution. And yet, in the back of his mind, Aizen couldn't help but consider a third variable in his calculations: Uehara Shiroa, the enigmatic wildcard whose potential seemed truly limitless. Unlike Ichigo, whose growth had been carefully nurtured through staged confrontations and calculated challenges, Shiroa represented an unknown quantity, one whose eventual peak even Aizen couldn't confidently predict. For now, however, Aizen's focus remained on the immediate battlefield. The Hogyoku pulsed warmly within his chest, responding to his desires and strengthening his resolve. It was more than a mere tool or weapon, it had become his greatest ally, the physical embodiment of his ambition to stand in the heavens. Chapter 267. As Aizen spoke, he reached up and deliberately tore open the front of his white shirt, revealing what appeared to be a small, perfectly spherical purple gem embedded in the center of his chest. The Hogyoku. Now fully complete after the fusion of Urahara's and Aizen's separate creations, pulsed with an otherworldly radiance that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around it. Its power was truly unimaginable, even to those who had dedicated centuries to understanding spiritual artifacts. Hogyoku! Ichigo exclaimed, his expression morphing from determination to confusion as he stared at the strange purple gem that emanated an aura unlike anything he had ever encountered. The spiritual pressure it released seemed to distort the air itself, creating ripples in the spiritual atmosphere that made Ichigo's skin crawl. According to the limited information Ichigo had gathered from his interactions with Urahara, the Hogyoku required an enormous amount of spiritual energy to awaken from its dormant state, several times that of a captain's entire Ryatsu reserve. This requirement explained why only someone with Aizen's immense spiritual pressure could fully activate the artifact. But everything Ichigo had learned suggested that the awakened Hogyoku was primarily a tool used to stabilize holofication envisored in Arankar, a catalyst for breaking the barriers between Shinigami and Hollow. The concept that this mysterious object could also rapidly heal life-threatening injuries was entirely new information that left him stunned. So this thing can also be used to recover from injuries? He thought, his mind racing to adjust his understanding of the threat before him. Aizen, meanwhile, was studying Ichigo with renewed interest. He observed the hollowed-out appearance of Kurosaki's mask and uniform, felt the residual Ryatsu still emanating from the wound he had just inflicted, and couldn't help but exclaim with genuine admiration. In such a short time, your Ryatsu has become significantly stronger. His eyes gleamed with scientific fascination. Is this another stage of your growth? That's truly remarkable. A satisfied smile spread across his face. Just as I expected. In Aizen's assessment, Kurosaki Ichigo's hollow transformation had reached an unprecedented level of perfection and stability. More importantly, it continued to demonstrate virtually infinite potential for further growth, a power that aligned perfectly with Aizen's own ambitions. The evolutionary capabilities of the Hogyoku were governed by specific desire and will, having a concrete reference target to model that evolution was invaluable. Ichigo Kurosaki standing before him represented an excellent benchmark, a living proof of concept. And somewhere out there, Uehara Shiroa existed as the most ideal target of all, though his powers remained frustratingly mysterious and impossible to fully comprehend or predict. Hearing Aizen's words, Ichigo's expression darkened with suspicion. Just as you expected, he repeated, his voice tinged with growing dread. What exactly do you mean by that? The statement had triggered an instinctive sense of unease, a premonition that something fundamental about his understanding of the world was about to be shattered. At this point, Aizen no longer saw any reason for secrecy. The time for masks and deception had passed. With cool deliberation, he laid bare the truth. Since the very moment you first gained the power of the Shinigami, everything you have experienced has been meticulously arranged by me, he revealed, his voice carrying an undertone of pride in his own craftsmanship. Every opponent you encountered was carefully selected and designed according to my specifications. Every battle, every victory, every seeming coincidence, all of it unfolded precisely according to my plan. He began pacing slowly, like a professor delivering a lecture. This includes Rukia helping you awaken your Shinigami powers, and your defeat of Ulquiorra that fully unleashed your latent potential. His eyes narrowed slightly.
Have you never wondered why Rukia happened to be in the human world at the exact moment you were attacked by a hollow?
Or why every adversary you faced was ultimately defeated by you after you managed to unlock a new aspect of your strength powerful enough to challenge you, but never completely beyond your capacity to overcome?
Aizen's smile turned condescending. Don't you find it all rather too convenient?
The perfect sequence of challenges, each one pushing you just far enough to force growth without crushing you completely. He gestured eloquently with one hand. It's like carefully pruning a young sapling into precisely the shape you desire, a delicate process where the scale is not easy to master. He paused, his expression becoming thoughtful. I will admit to some concern that certain opponents I arranged might prove too formidable and potentially hamper your development. But the results. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Your growth has actually exceeded even my calculated expectations.
How truly magnificent you've become, Kurosaki Ichigo.
The pride Aizen felt in having successfully manipulated Ichigo's development, guiding him step by step into becoming the powerful warrior who now stood before him, was comparable only to the satisfaction he had experienced upon successfully creating the Hogyoku itself. Both achievements represented triumphs that defied established rules and transcended accepted limitations, his greatest masterpieces. Now, these two crowning accomplishments were about to converge into a single magnificent culmination.
Even the normally composed Aizen couldn't fully conceal his excitement at the prospect. Double success would bring double joy, elevating him to heights no Shinigami had ever reached.
As if responding to his emotions, the will of the Hogyoku seemed to pulse with increasing intensity, awakening further with each passing moment. In parallel, Aizen's carefully maintained rationality began to fracture around the edges, consumed by the fires of anticipation and triumph.
Gradually, he was allowing himself to surrender to the intoxication of imminent transcendence.
In the distant sanctuary of the Ice Palace, Uehara Shiroa, Yoruichi Shibuin, and Nell watched the entire confrontation between Ichigo Kurosaki and Aizen unfold with varying degrees of interest. The complex exchange of blows and strategies had Yoruichi and Nell completely captivated, both women exclaiming over particularly impressive maneuvers or shocking revelations, thoroughly immersed in the spectacle. Uehara Shiroa, however, regarded their enthusiasm with thinly veiled contempt. In his estimation, they were simply making unnecessary noise over what amounted to nothing more than a pair of losers ineffectually pecking at each other like squabbling birds.
Both Aizen and Ichigo Kurosaki had fallen significantly in his estimation, neither one having yet demonstrated their true capabilities.
From his perspective, the battle had not even approached its genuine critical juncture, the point at which both combatants would be forced to reveal the full extent of their power. It was merely the preliminary act of a much grander performance. While Yoruichi and Nellil could only observe the surface level of the conflict, the visible exchanges of techniques and the physical manifestations of spiritual pressure, Shiroa's perception extended far deeper. His perfect level observation haki had already spread across the vast distance to encompass the fake Karakura town where the two opponents fought, penetrating to the very essence of their respective powers. His clairvoyance abilities activated, Shiroa had already glimpsed the higher-level forms that both fighters would eventually assume, transformations that had yet to materialize in the present timeline. This foresight maintained his interest in an otherwise predictable confrontation. With his enhanced perception, Shiroa could clearly observe what neither Ichigo nor the spectating Shinigami had yet realized. Aizen was quietly integrating aspects of Ichigo Kurosaki's hollow power into himself. The complete Hogyoku served as the critical catalyst for this process, facilitating the transfer and integration of spiritual information. Everything was unfolding exactly as Aizen had claimed. All of Ichigo Kurosaki's power improvements had indeed been orchestrated by the mastermind, but not out of any altruistic desire to see Ichigo reach his potential. Rather, Ichigo had always been a means to an end, a useful tool in Aizen's greater design. Aizen needed Ichigo to fully manifest all his powers, serving both as a guiding light for evolution and as excellent raw material to be harvested at the appropriate moment. True to his nature, Aizen never engaged in anything without clear purpose and benefit. It was Ichigo Kurosaki's unique power, his hybrid nature combining Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy elements, that had so thoroughly captivated Aizen's scientific curiosity. The architect of this masterpiece felt genuine pride in what Urahara had managed to create, almost as if appreciating a rival artist's work. Simultaneously, Aizen had grown profoundly weary of the muggles surrounding him, ordinary Shinigami whose limitations frustrated his ambitions. He longed from the depths of his soul to encounter beings of comparable capacity, equals with whom he could engage on his level. Entities like Uehara Shiroa, the Soul King, and Hayasu Bichibai didn't qualify in Aizen's estimation. He categorized them not as potential peers but as supermodels, idealized examples of what he aspired to become, targets to be surpassed, conquered, and ultimately destroyed. In Aizen's complex mental hierarchy, Kurosaki Ichigo occupied a unique position, a being close enough to Aizen's own nature to be recognizable, yet not developed enough to represent a genuine threat. Simultaneously, Ichigo possessed irreplaceable value as a control subject and power source, a critical reason why Aizen had invested so much effort in cultivating the boy's potential. In the crude but apt metaphor that flashed through Shiroa's mind, Aizen was essentially farming Ichigo like a gardener tends a prized vegetable, nurturing him to the point of perfect ripeness before the harvest. Chapter 268. Now, as Uehara Shiroa watched with detached amusement, the little apple had finally ripened to perfection. Aizen, playing the role of a diligent fruit farmer, had begun to swing his metaphorical sickle, harvesting the power he so desperately needed for his own evolution. This evolutionary process unfolded with crystal clarity before Shiroa's enhanced perception, every nuance visible through his observation haki. The methodology struck him as undeniably clever. Perfectly aligned with Aizen's character as the consummate strategist and intellectual. For hundreds of years, the masterful manipulator had planned with painstaking precision, gathering resources from across the spiritual realms to forcibly pioneer a pathway of evolution that no Shinigami had ever attempted. Even by Aizen's exacting standards, a man who pursued perfection in all things, this evolutionary approach was both elegant and feasible, a testament to his brilliance. Yet Shiroa recognized a fundamental truth that Aizen, in his hubris, had overlooked: sometimes excessive complexity and perfection become liabilities rather than assets. Power that appears flawless on the surface often harbors catastrophic weaknesses beneath. This reality remained invisible to Aizen in his current state. Through his observation haki, Uehara Shiroa could clearly perceive what the self-proclaimed transcendent could not. That Aizen had already begun to drift from his moorings, his legendary self-control fracturing under the influence of the Hogyoku. The pursuit of perfection beyond established limits carried an inevitable cost: the gradual erosion of rationality itself. Evolution that transcended natural boundaries would invariably burn away the original framework of consciousness, a price that such radical transformation demanded. Shiroa recalled how, in the original timeline, Aizen had personally executed Tozenkan, not out of necessity or betrayal, but simply to sever ties with his past and with the Shinigami identity he was abandoning. For the creation of a truly new self, everything old and familiar had to be discarded without sentiment or hesitation. This ruthless shedding of the past was, in some ways, perfectly logical. New power demanded new vessels, unencumbered by outdated limitations. But what price would Aizen ultimately pay for this transformation? What essential aspects of himself would be sacrificed upon the altar of transcendence? While contemplating these questions, Uehara Shiroa casually tested the backdoor he had previously installed within the Hogyoku's complex structure. Everything appeared to be functioning normally. Aizen remained oblivious to the subtle infiltration of his prized possession. As expected, he hasn't noticed a thing, Shiroa thought with satisfaction. The hidden modification would only gradually manifest its effects after the Hogyoku achieved perfect integration with its host. Had Aizen maintained his previous state of hypervigilance and analytical clarity, there might have been a slight possibility he would discover the tampering. Even failing direct detection, the old Aizen's wisdom and paranoia would likely have led him to suspect interference and implement countermeasures. But the current Aizen, intoxicated by imminent godhood, had abandoned his former caution. He was completely unprepared, having lost the absolute calm and perfect rationality that had defined him for centuries. This vulnerability represented just one of many prices he was unknowingly paying for his transformation. Through the combined application of the Mind Gem and his enhanced version of Unlimited Blade Works, Uehara Shiroa had effectively placed the Hogyoku under his indirect control. The original Unlimited Blade Works ability would have been insufficient to influence something as powerful and complex as the fused Hogyoku, but Shiroa's abilities had evolved far beyond their original parameters. After system enhancement, his Unlimited Blade Works had been elevated to EX classification, a supreme capability that transcended the baseline version from which it had been derived. Additionally, the relentless training regimen he had imposed upon hundreds of shadow clones, working day and night without respite, had dramatically improved his proficiency with the ability. As a result, Shiroa's Unlimited Blade Works had expanded beyond merely controlling conventional weapons. It could now extend its influence to specific treasures and artifacts of great power. Meanwhile, the Hogyoku's unique nature as a semi-sentient entity with its own will made it vulnerable to the influence of the Mind Gem, creating the perfect confluence of circumstances for Shiroa's plan. Through the combined power of the Infinity Gem, meticulous advance preparation, and a measure of fortunate timing, Uehara Shiroa had managed to establish firm control over the complete Hogyoku without directly claiming it. His reasons for not immediately asserting this control were multifaceted. Primarily, he felt no urgent need to complete the special task and claim its associated rewards. The proficiency level of his EX-ranked Unlimited Blade Works had already reached the Great Perfection level, a plateau that proved resistant to further improvement despite the continuous practice of his Shadow Clone army. Abilities at the highest tier seemed to follow different rules of development, making it exceptionally difficult to progress beyond certain thresholds of mastery. Nevertheless, even at its current level, this trump card made Shiroa confident that he could face even the most formidable transcendent beings without disadvantage. With this capability in his arsenal, Uehara Shiroa's strategy emphasized steady progression, gradually improving his base attributes while methodically exploring the potential for life evolution at his own pace. Unlike Aizen, who rushed headlong toward godhood, Shiroa recognized the value of consolidating each level of power before advancing to the next. His current challenge wasn't a lack of top-tier abilities, but rather a shortage of EX-class capabilities with perfect proficiency, or ideally, skills that transcended even the perfect level of mastery. While completing new special tasks and claiming their rewards would certainly enhance his overall strength and foundation, the immediate impact would be relatively minor compared to his existing capabilities. Even with additional EX abilities, surpassing the effective combat potential of his Great Perfection level Unlimited Blade Works in the short term would prove challenging. In his current state, Uehara Shiroa assessed himself as roughly equivalent to a Yawatch with both of the Almighty's pupils activated, already possessing an absolute core ability and ultimate trump card that placed him at the pinnacle of the Bleach universe's power hierarchy. His strategy was clear: by raising his mastery of Unlimited Blade Works to its absolute limit, he would achieve functional invincibility within this world. Additional rewards remained desirable but not critical to his immediate plans. The situation paralleled Aizen's own choices after merging with the Hogyoku. Though the transformed Shinigami had gained the ability to absorb other souls to enhance himself, a defining characteristic of Hollows, he disdained the idea of consuming the relatively paltry power of the Espada or Gotei 13 captains, focusing exclusively on Ichigo Kurosaki as a worthy source. This selectivity stemmed from a simple calculation: even as the Primera Espada, Aizen already possessed more raw power than all 10 Espada combined. Absorbing these ants would yield no qualitative improvement to his capabilities, merely adding negligible quantities to an already vast reservoir. Uehara Shiroa operated under similar principles. The accumulation of standard task rewards represented mere icing on the cake for someone at his level. An additional S-rank or even SR rank ability could not meaningfully improve his combat effectiveness at this stage of development. What truly mattered were legendary tier abilities and artifacts, and more specifically, top-level capabilities with extraordinarily high proficiency ratings. He had reached the point where consolidating his foundation and refining his core abilities yielded greater returns than accumulating miscellaneous task rewards. With this strategic clarity, Shiroa had committed to patience, methodically pursuing the complete Hogyoku acquisition task to achieve maximum completion and optimize the benefits it would eventually yield. Additionally, he recognized that unlocking the Hogyoku's full potential, merging with it, and awakening its complete power would represent a major undertaking requiring careful preparation and timing. Unlike Aizen, who rushed toward transcendence with reckless abandon, Shiroha would move with calculated precision, ensuring that each step in his evolution remained firmly under his control.
Chapter 269. The semi-finished Hogyoku held little value for Uehara Shiroha.
Beyond its limited practical utility, acquiring such an incomplete artifact would significantly reduce the quality of his task rewards.
System rewards scaled with challenge and achievement.
Settling for a prototype would be tantamount to accepting mediocrity. Therefore, his objective remained clear: he needed to obtain the Hogyoku in its complete and perfect state, with all its powers fully actualized and accessible. However, Uehara Shiroha had no desire to expend his own time and energy nurturing the artifact to maturity.
Such tedious cultivation work was beneath someone of his caliber.
Instead, he had cleverly positioned himself to benefit from the efforts of others.
Specifically, the two unwitting employees currently battling in fake Karakura Town, Aizen and Kurosaki Ichigo. Their conflict served his purposes perfectly, pushing the Hogyoku toward its strongest state of perfect awakening, step by meticulous step.
This is precisely what I anticipated, Shiroha thought with satisfaction as he observed their struggle. The time for harvest was approaching, and he wouldn't even need to dirty his hands with the cultivation process. The sophisticated monitoring technique Shiroha employed allowed him to observe the battle with extraordinary precision. Unlike conventional surveillance methods, his approach captured not only high-definition visuals and audio but also the subtle nuances of spiritual pressure, emotional states, and even the characteristic signatures of each combatant's ryatsu. Every detail of the confrontation, every word, every gesture, every fluctuation in spiritual energy
was transmitted with perfect clarity to his ice screen.
This remarkable surveillance technology left Shihu and Yoruchi genuinely amazed, despite her extensive experience with advanced spiritual tools. As the former head of one of Seoul society's great noble families, she had been exposed to countless wonders and privileged technologies throughout her centuries of life. She had witnessed the fabled treasures of the nobility, the secret weapons of the Onmitsukido, and the experimental devices of the 12th Division. But the ice screen before her transcended all of these. At first glance, it appeared to be merely an ordinary sheet of crystal and ice, perhaps decorative, but not particularly remarkable.
This unassuming appearance belied its true sophistication.
Not only could it display images with a clarity that surpassed any monitor in Seoul society, but it could also transmit sound with perfect fidelity, and most impressively accurately convey the spiritual characteristics and ryatsu signatures of everyone within its surveillance range. Such capabilities matched or even exceeded the legendary automatic recording techniques of the Great Spirit Book Corridor maintained by the Tsuneyashiro family. Yoruchi suspected that only the Zero Division in the mysterious Soul King Palace might possess surveillance technology of comparable advancement. Yet despite the unprecedented nature of this technology, Yoruchi found herself growing accustomed to Uehara Shiroha's seemingly endless array of surprising abilities and tools. Had anyone else demonstrated such remarkable technology, she would have been utterly shocked and full of questions.
But with Shiroha, it almost seemed expected.
The extraordinary had become ordinary in his presence. Through this immersive surveillance method, Yoruchi was able to observe concerning anomalies in Aizen's capabilities. His defensive resilience and recovery speed had clearly transcended the normal parameters of Shinigami physiology. Yet perplexingly, he continued to insist that he had not completed hollowification, a claim that seemed increasingly dubious with each demonstration of his enhanced abilities.
Watching Aizen's clearly augmented form, Shiho and Yoruchi felt her confusion mounting.
Her knowledge of the Hogyoku was admittedly limited.
Initially, she had understood it to be a tool for stabilizing hollowification, a medical device of sorts that could preserve lives caught between Shinigami and hollow states. Later revelations had painted a darker picture.
The Hogyoku had been identified as the catalyst responsible for the forced hollowification of Hirako Shinji, Muguruma Kensei, and the other original members of the Vizard. This suggested its primary function was to break down the natural barriers between Shinigami and Hollow, a key to forcibly merging the two spiritual species. But now, observing Aizen with the Hogyoku embedded directly in his chest, Yoruchi found herself questioning her understanding once again.
What did it mean for a Shinigami to physically incorporate the Hogyoku into their body?
The implications seemed enormous and deeply troubling. Moreover, Aizen had demonstrated the ability to withstand Ichigo's Getsuga Tensho attack with minimal damage and recover almost instantaneously, capabilities that strongly resembled a Hollow's Hierro skin and high-speed regeneration. If these abilities didn't constitute hollowification, then what exactly defined the boundary between Shinigami and Hollow? By this point, Yoruichi had developed the practical habit of turning to Uehara Shiroa whenever she encountered questions beyond her knowledge. She shifted her gaze from the ice screen to Shiroa's composed profile, her golden eyes narrowing with curiosity. "This Hogyoku is abnormally powerful," she observed, gesturing toward the screen. "Has Aizen truly not completed his hollowification process yet? Or is this another of his deceptions?" Hearing Yoruichi's questions regarding the Hogyoku and Aizen's true state, Uehara Shiroa responded with characteristic calm, his voice measured and unhurried. "You could say that he has, and equally, you could say that he hasn't," he replied enigmatically. "Aizen typically disdains deceiving people with outright lies, he prefers to mislead them with carefully presented truths, which is a far more sophisticated form of deception." Shiroa leaned forward slightly, his eyes reflecting the light from the ice screen. "The concept of hollowification is indeed just a superficial label, a convenient simplification that masks a far more complex reality. The current Hogyoku is no longer the incomplete artifact that Urahara and Aizen separately created. It's a new entity born from their fusion, vastly more perfect and potent than either original." His fingers traced idle patterns on the arm of his ice throne. The capabilities of such a treasure extend far beyond merely assisting with hollowification. Besides, he added with a knowing smile, Aizen holds the Arrancar in contempt and considers the visor to be failed experiments. He would never pursue simple hollowification for himself. Shiroa's expression grew more serious. What Aizen seeks is something far more ambitious, a perfected form of hollowification that transcends mere species hybridization. He wants evolution in its purest sense. By fusing with the new and perfect Hogyoku, he has gained the theoretical possibility of breaking through the inherent limitations that separate Shinigami from Hollow, and perhaps from all spiritual beings. His voice dropped to a near whisper, though it lost none of its intensity. He wants to surpass the very concept of Shinigami entirely, and become a god. In reality, Uehara Shiroa recognized that the current Aizen had only reached what could be classified as the first stage of collapse Aizen according to the evolutionary framework he had observed in other timelines. This form remained significantly distant from the true transcendent state that Aizen ultimately sought. Nevertheless, even this initial transformation phase had rendered Aizen formidable beyond conventional measurement. His defensive capabilities now allowed him to withstand direct attacks from captain-level Shinigami with only superficial injuries. His recovery abilities had begun to manifest aspects of complete regeneration, comparable to the high-speed healing exhibited by Vasto Lord-class Hollows. Although Aizen maintained the outward appearance of a Shinigami, he had already begun the process of fusing with the Hogyoku on a fundamental level. In turn, the semi-sentient artifact had begun actively protecting both itself and its host. This symbiotic relationship meant that at this stage of development, it had become virtually impossible to eliminate Aizen through conventional combat techniques. Standard Bankai releases, no matter how powerful within the normal spectrum of Shinigami abilities, would prove ineffective against him. Only the most exceptional Zanpakuto manifestations, those approaching the devastating power of Yamamoto's Zanka no Tachi, might stand a chance of inflicting meaningful damage. The second evolutionary stage of Collapse Aizen would prove even more terrifying. Though technically still categorizable as Shinigami by the broadest definition, an Aizen at that level would demonstrate Reiatsu reserves, offensive capability, speed, defensive resilience, and regenerative capacity far exceeding his current state. Even Kido spells above level 90. The most destructive incantations known to Shinigami would barely affect him. At that stage, his spiritual pressure would become so immense that it would exceed the perceptual limits of experienced captains like Shiba Ishin and genius innovators like Urahara Kisuke. They would literally be unable to sense the full extent of his power, as it would exist beyond their frame of reference. The third evolutionary stage would position Aizen at the absolute boundary between Shinigami and Hollow, enabling him to casually destroy conventional limitations that had defined spiritual beings for millennia. At that point,
the laws that govern normal Shinigami would become meaningless in his presence. Chapter 270. Shinigami and Hollows represented fundamentally different spiritual species, each defined by distinct evolutionary paths and inherent limitations. While Shinigami excelled in precise spiritual manipulation and technique refinement, Hollows possessed naturally superior physical attributes, stronger bodies capable of tearing through dimensional barriers, instinctive Hierro skin defenses, and regenerative capabilities that most Shinigami could never achieve naturally. These racial characteristics established ceiling limits for each species, boundaries that even the most gifted individuals rarely transcended through conventional development. The transformation of Shinigami into Visored or Hollows into Arrancar represented attempts to push beyond these inherent limitations, incorporating advantageous traits from the opposing species while maintaining core identity. What made the third stage of Collapse Aizen truly extraordinary was that it perfectly synthesized the extreme talents of all four categories: Shinigami, Hollows, Arrancar, and Visored, without inheriting any of their characteristic weaknesses or defects. This wasn't merely combining strengths, it was creating an entirely new category of spiritual being that exceeded established parameters in every measurable aspect. At this evolutionary stage, Aizen would exist as an overstandard entity, a being that had transcended ordinary rules and limitations. The frameworks that constrained other spiritual entities would simply no longer apply to him. This fundamental difference in nature would enable him to effortlessly destroy barriers previously considered unbreakable by conventional Shinigami powers. The fourth stage of Collapse Aizen would represent an even more profound transformation, a complete transcendence beyond the fundamental limitations of both Shinigami and Hollow existence. At this level, Aizen's power would comprehensively surpass all established limits of the four spiritual categories, placing him in an entirely different dimensional realm of existence. This stage represented true transcendence, the emergence of a being that could no longer be meaningfully compared to ordinary Shinigami or Hollows, just as they could not be meaningfully compared to ordinary humans. The transformation would be qualitative rather than quantitative. A fundamental shift in the nature of existence rather than merely an increase in power. The theoretical fifth and sixth stages of collapse would continue this evolutionary progression, developing and refining Aizen's capabilities within this transcendent realm. Each transformation after the initial stage represented not merely an increase in raw power, but an essential evolution of his very lifeform. Each change would fundamentally alter what Aizen was, not simply how strong he had become. Given this broader context, Shihoin Yoruchi's surprise at Aizen's current capabilities was somewhat premature. She was witnessing merely the first hints of a transformation process that would ultimately yield powers beyond imagination. Moreover, Uehara Shiroa recognized that if the complete Hogyoku's sole purpose had been to facilitate hollowification or create Arrancar, it would have represented a pointless endeavor for someone of Aizen's ambition. The 10 Espada. His supposedly elite Arrancar warriors were little more than insects compared to his own power. He could defeat them all with minimal effort. Becoming merely another such ant would have been meaningless to someone with Aizen's grandiose vision. Aizen's true objective was far more ambitious: to evolve himself into a godlike being comparable to the Soul King, while simultaneously creating subordinates of power equivalent to the Zero Division captains. The Hogyoku was indispensable to this plan, representing the only known catalyst capable of facilitating such extreme evolution and creating the Oken, the king's key required to access the Soul King's realm. Though creating the Oken demanded the sacrifice of all souls residing in Karakura town, a horrific genocide by any moral standard, such a price was entirely acceptable to Aizen. The road to evolutionary transcendence was necessarily paved with sacrifice, and sentimentality had no place in his calculations. Aizen's current position had not been easily achieved. He had manipulated events across centuries, betrayed allies, orchestrated countless deaths, and sacrificed everything that once defined him as a Shinigami to reach this point. His journey represented an extraordinary investment of patience, intelligence, and ruthless determination. Recognizing this, Uehara Shiroa felt no guilt about his intention to appropriate the fruits of Aizen's labor for his own benefit, transforming the traitor's lifetime of effort into a foundation for his own power. In Shiroa's view, this approach represented the most efficient use of Aizen's painstaking work. Why let such potential go to waste? Beside him, Nell appeared completely disconnected from this complex strategic discussion.
The childlike Arrancar's eyes had begun to glaze over during Shiroa's explanation, her expression suggesting she was fighting a losing battle against boredom and drowsiness. Though she clearly wanted to doze off, she didn't quite dare to do so in Shiroa's presence, resulting in a peculiar state of forced alertness.
So that's it.
Yoruchi exclaimed, her eyes widening with sudden understanding. The puzzle pieces had finally fallen into place, creating a coherent picture of Aizen's grand design.
Everything about his plan now made perfect sense.
If the Hogyoku's abilities had truly been as simple as facilitating hollowification, Aizen would never have gone to such extraordinary lengths to obtain the complete version. Looking back, she could now see that every aspect of his centuries-long conspiracy had revolved around acquiring and perfecting the Hogyoku. His 100-year silence following the hollowification incident hadn't been merely strategic concealment, he had been patiently waiting, unable to proceed until he had secured the complete Hogyoku. The artifact truly was the keystone of his entire plan, the linchpin upon which all his ambitions depended.
A sobering realization dawned on her.
It seems that the outcome of this war was determined the moment Aizen obtained the Hogyoku, she said thoughtfully. Urahara Kisuke only managed to guess a few key points about Aizen's overall plan, while you, her golden eyes fixed on Shiroa with newfound appreciation, you've understood everything from the beginning. Her voice took on a tone of quiet admiration. You've always known, and with perfect clarity. You can see through secrets that Aizen struggled for centuries to conceal as easily as looking through glass. All his carefully guarded mysteries are completely exposed to your perception.
You know not only the broad strokes but every minute detail.
She leaned forward, her expression intense.
That's why you understand the true function of the new Hogyoku and the full scope of Aizen's plans with such precision.
And that means, her eyes narrowed with sudden insight, you must have a backup plan, a counter-strategy already in place. When analyzing the situation, Yoruchi had instinctively positioned herself as Shiroa's ally, her perspective completely aligned with his interests. Her faith in him had become absolute, built upon repeated demonstrations of his seemingly limitless insight and capability. This unwavering confidence had led her to the correct general conclusion, though she remained ignorant of the specific details. While she had correctly deduced that Uehara Shiroa possessed some form of trump card against Aizen, she had no conception of what that countermeasure might be, nor any understanding of Shiroa's true objectives in this elaborate game.
Uehara Shiroa glanced at Shihu and Yoruchi, a faint smile playing across his lips.
Her intuition continued to impress him, beneath her combat prowess and noble bearing lay a formidable analytical mind. You truly are a remarkably intelligent woman, he acknowledged with genuine appreciation.
And yes, I do possess a trump card. However, he added, his tone cooling slightly, the current Aizen isn't yet worthy of me deploying it. Let's wait until he overcomes this particular hurdle first.
As if perfectly timed to punctuate his statement, 3 new combatants entered the battlefield displayed on the ice screen: Shiba Ishin, Urahara Kisuke, and Ishida Ryukin. All launching coordinated attacks against Aizen. This marked a departure from the original timeline that Shiroa recalled, where Ishida Ryukin had remained absent from this battle. In that version of events, it had been Yoruchi herself, equipped with specialized anti-hero armor, who had joined the assault against Aizen, finally exacting her revenge for the hollowification incident. Now, with Yoruchi comfortably seated beside him in the Ice Palace, Ishida Ryukin had stepped in to fill the gap in the attacking trio. The last pure-blooded Quincy's combat abilities were not to be underestimated. Though he had once dismissed his son Urio's potential with the casual statement that the boy lacked talent because he lacked interest, the truth was far more complex. In reality, Ishida Uryu possessed a script, a sacred letter ability that granted immunity to the omniscient and omnipotent powers of Yhwach, the Quincy progenitor. His complete antithesis belonged to the same category as Yhwach's most potent script abilities and A-class power of extraordinary rarity and effectiveness. If such potential could be dismissed as no talent, then what exactly constituted talent in Ryukin's estimation? The question remained unanswered, but the elder Ishida's presence on the battlefield suggested he possessed formidable abilities of his own. On the battlefield, after a brief greeting to his son Ichigo, Shiba Ishin wasted no time engaging Aizen directly. He swung his Zanpakuto in a broad arc, the blade whistling through the air as it slashed toward the traitor captain. Supporting this frontal assault, Ishida Ryukin had activated his blood-infused Quincy uniform, the white fabric gleaming with spiritual power as he drew back his spirit bow. A continuous barrage of destructive sacred arrows streaked toward Aizen, designed to contain and limit his movement options while Isshin and Urahara pressed their attacks. The coordinated assault represented perhaps the last best hope of conventional spiritual warriors against Aizen's evolving power.
Three masters, each representing a different spiritual tradition, Shinigami, Scientist, and Quincy, had united against a common threat.
Yet as Uehara Shiroha observed their valiant efforts with detached interest, he already knew the outcome this battle would yield. That wraps up this part of What If Transmigrated in Bleach World.
Thanks so much for listening.
As always, new parts drop every 4 days, so be sure to stay tuned. Also check out my Patreon channel for early releases of all the series, where you can find all the series released one day ahead of YouTube. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and please consider supporting the original author as well.
See you in the next one.